So, hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm with Yiibu. We're based in Edinburgh, and we're a design consultancy, and we focus primarily on mobile. Have done so for about 5 years now, and we're pretty platform agnostic. As a matter of fact, lately we're almost entirely focused on mobile web. So today I'm going to talk about user experience in general. This process doesn't, or what I'm going to talk about is not even really a process, but it doesn't apply entirely to mobile. It applies in some ways to design of almost anything. But with mobile, I think you have to be even more agile in your development processes with mobile because, again, we've got fragmentation, lots of platforms, lots of different customers who need different things. And obviously the field is quite competitive. There's new products every day. And so, spending 18 months developing something, it just doesn't work. You need to get it out there, and you need to find ways to really target in on what your customers want. So, user experience. User experience is a word that wasn't really around a few years ago. I'm not quite sure what the previous word was, if there even really was one. But you hear that word a lot nowadays, and it's a little bit hard to figure out what it means sometimes. And really the root of it is that it just kind of means design. I mean, in some ways, design is kind of a big process that has all sorts of different steps and different elements to it. User experience is kind of a way of describing everything you do, basically, to design a product. And so in some ways, the first step to a great user experience is kind of understanding what user experience means and what it doesn't mean. A lot of people, for example, think it means visual design, which it doesn't necessarily. So I'll go through some examples. User experience is not really a process. There is some process to it, and there's some steps, and if you follow certain steps, you will end up with a better product usually because you end up with more iteration, more design time, more experimentation, but it's not necessarily this rigid process. As a matter of fact, if you Google it, you won't really find one person talking about one process, just a lot of people talking about things that help make products better. And so it's more so a state of mind. It's a way of thinking about how you design a product. And it's kind of an approach to everything you do when you're thinking about how to design your product. And as a result, it can be very hard to measure, which large companies and small companies don't always like, because it's not, you can't just say, okay, this is what we're going to do and it's going to work because this is how it works. And you don't always quite know when you've done it or when you haven't. Except usually that if your customers are happy, you're probably headed in the right direction. So measuring user experience, or trying to, is something I don't really recommend. There's other aspects you can measure, and by all means measure usability, make sure your product is really usable. By all means make sure that it's, that your sales are what you want them to be, that your user base is what you want it to be, but don't try to measure somehow how great the experience is, because you won't quite be able to figure it out that precisely, and it's kind of a waste of time in some ways. And a lot of it comes down to statements like this, that there's things that you can count and there's things that you can't, but the things that you can't are just as important. And certainly when it comes to mobile products, or products in general, technology products for sure, the user experience is the sum of all sorts of parts. I mean, it's not just do this and this and this and the features add up to something great. It's more than that. So what is user experience? I mean, part of it is how a product looks, but that's just part of it. Certainly the look and feel is really, really important, and some products almost focus entirely on look, but there's a lot more to it than that. Usability is definitely a factor, and again, with new platforms and new devices, usability is becoming more and more important, especially when a user is used to a certain platform working one way, and then maybe you're porting to a different platform and you end up doing it a bit differently. So it's really important to be sure to test the usability of your application. And then there's also behavior, and behavior, again, for mobile is kind of different than what it was for potentially other types of platforms. This is an application called Things, and what Things does really well is that it syncs quite seamlessly, really, with desktop apps, with other Things apps that you might have on different devices. And so the behavior and how you sync and how easy it is to do it, or how not easy it is to do it, it has a lot to do with whether this app is popular or not. And then there's also language. And language doesn't simply have to be words. I mean, I kind of purposely chose this because I'm not a musician, but I think if you are a musician, you could probably look at this and decide, okay, what kind of product is this? Is this a professional product? Is this for beginners? Is it for amateurs? Is it for children? There's a lot about how something looks as well as the actual language that helps you kind of understand, is this a product for me? Is this something I'm going to want to use? And then, of course, there's performance, which a lot of people focus on with technology, and then they sometimes kind of forget the rest. Performance is, of course, really important, and certainly in things like games, it's really important. But then there's a lot of other apps where, performance maybe doesn't matter quite as much as other things. And so user experience is kind of thinking about all of that. And then specifically thinking about users. I mean, when you think about products that you love, it's kind of how you feel about a product, is whether the user experience is good. And then the flip side of that, how you feel is potentially something that you can kind of rationalize. You can say, okay, I like this thing, I don't like that thing. But then there's also the slightly less rational part. How does it make you feel? I've seen people who say that they don't like the iPhone, but you hand it to them and they immediately kind of start playing with it. So there's both of those sides. Again, stuff that you can measure and then maybe stuff that you can't measure at all, but that's still really important. So it's not about the software or the platform or the technology. It's about creating products that make people happy, really is what most things are. And even the most practical product on a certain level has to make you happy, or at the very least has to not make you, or shouldn't make you unhappy, because there's a lot of products that make people angry, that frustrate people. And so products have to treat people well. This is really important. I mean, it's a relationship you have with the customer. You have to treat them well. It has to improve their lives in some way, and not stress them out. Again, this is one of my all-time important ones, really, because so many products just stress people out, and it's just not fair, especially if it's something they've paid for. And then, again, it has to fit into their lives, and with the focus on them, it's really easy when you're building products to think about what you would like, but most of the time, the vast majority of the time, the product is not for you, it's for somebody else. Which brings us to point number 2, which is your product is not for everyone. And even if you think you've got this unlimited market and there's all these people, your product actually has to be for someone specific. And in all reality, it's actually going to be for a bunch of people. But you have to kind of know who those people are to actually be able to build something that they're going to like. And I'll talk about that just a bit more afterwards. So how do you decide who it is the product's for, and how you're going to please these people and why you're even going to do it? So do some research. All products can benefit from research. I mean, almost anything you design, research will help immeasurably. For starters, it helps you generate ideas, evaluate ideas, challenge your ideas that you might have had at the beginning about what it is you're making. You can understand the strengths and the weaknesses, and again, this is either the strengths of your product or maybe even the strengths of the competitor's product, where the weaknesses are, so that you can potentially target in on what they're not doing right. Uncover user behaviors and motivations. I mean, most products, again, fit into behavior somehow. They respond to something that a person wants to do, is doing, has done, and wants to help them do better. And then determine personas, which again, who are you trying to please? Why is this product going to work for this person? And then just define the use cases. How is it going to be used? What are the most common ways it's going to be used? And therefore, again, how do your features fit into that? So we'll talk about a few types of research that you can do. And these are all kind of inexpensive things that anyone can do. And this is kind of, everything I'm talking about today, ideally, is stuff that any company can do, which is why it's so beneficial. You don't need a whole bunch of money, and you don't need too much process. It's just remembering to try to do some of this stuff. Observation is really, really easy. Go out there and look at people. And if you're designing a product, a banking product, go into a bank, go on the high street and wander into the bank, listen to people talking about what kinds of transactions they're doing in the bank, what problems they're having. And almost any product, you can find a place to observe people that have something to do with that. And it has to be in a real context. There's maybe a time and a place to bring people into kind of a laboratory setting and say, okay, we're going to observe you doing this. But ideally, you want to see people in a real context, because that's where they'll behave, the way they're behaving, and where you can start to figure out if your product would fit into what they're doing. Another interesting bit is looking at the context minus the person. A lot of products, especially technology products, solve some sort of problem that has to do with kind of daily habits of some sort, whether it's a product for at work or at home. And a lot of times seeing the environment, seeing what people have done, where they've made notes, how they've stuck them up, and where could your product fit in, or how could your product help with whatever this person's problem is. And this person may have a few problems at this point. Next type of research that's really handy is photographic studies. And this is particularly handy and easy to do now versus maybe 5-10 years ago. Flickr, you can take photographs or you can collect them. Flickr is an amazing place to collect photographs. A lot of them are Creative Commons. All the ones here today are Creative Commons, which is why I'm able to reuse them. But if you're just using them for internal research, they don't even really have to be licensed any particular way. You can just kind of gather them up. But there's pictures from all over the world of people doing all sorts of things, and it's really amazing what you can gather up, actually. I mean, I did a study a while ago of cash machines, and you just go to Flickr, look for cash machines, you'll find pictures from all over the world, and you start to see similarities right away of the problems people have when they're using the machine, how they stand, where they stand, problems with privacy, people peeking over their shoulders. So there's a lot you can see just from taking pictures and kind of comparing them. And what you want to do is keep track of common problems and behaviors. Again, if you start to compare different people doing different stuff, you'll notice patterns of behavior all the time that are quite common. People have similar problems with similar things. And so then, your goal really is to try to solve some of those problems. Interviews, obviously you talk to people. I mean, watching is one thing. Talking to people is also really, really useful. What people often think is what we're talking about is focus groups, especially because focus groups have been quite popular in the last century, really, as a way to kind of get information from consumers. This is kind of different. The idea is not to do the focus group, and the main reason really is, to use another quote, people don't really know what they want, especially if it's a new thing, and with technology, a lot of things are new. So if you simply ask them, would you like X? In this case, if you would ask this gentleman if he wanted an automobile, he wouldn't have known what you were talking about, why you might want it. It probably would have sounded like this big, cumbersome, smelly, complicated thing that he didn't want, when in fact, it probably will have solved a lot of the problems he had. So asking people what they want isn't always the best way to get the information. What you really want to do is, again, ask people about their habits. So, you're designing an application for accountants, something like Free Agent here that I use as well. I would assume that they've spoken to a lot of accountants and a lot of small businesses and said, okay, tell me about how you do your accounting. And get people to tell you their story about how they do what they're doing now. And you'll immediately start to hear people's problems, where they get stuck, where they would like something to help solve their problem. And again, it's about habits and behaviors, and keeping track of the common problems and frustrations, and then you try to zero in on those.